ask most people, they'll tell you Toyota will grossly outlast Mercedes. And while that was an actual fact several years back, things have changed grossly, and clearly the modern day technology have leveled the playing field. I'm here to explain to you how, in fact, a modern day Mercedes can easily outlast the modern day Toyota. Let's get into it now. I'm here to tell you a lot has actually changed between these two cars. Obviously, here we have a late model Mercedes C300. It's got a 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder engine, and it makes about 242 horsepower. Over here, we have a Toyota Camry, and it actually has a naturally aspirated 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine, makes about 200 horsepower. These both come with all-wheel drive. This particular car comes now with the SE all-wheel drive, and of course, you've upped the complexity because an old-school Toyota was typically only front-wheel drive. So now you've added extra maintenance, extra potential failure points. Here on this Mercedes, now this one happens to be a 4MATIC. This, of course, also is an all-wheel drive system. But over here in the Mercedes, as you can see, we have an engine that runs front to back. So in other words, it's longitudinal mounted, and of course it has a transmission behind it, which primarily drives the power to the rear wheels with auxiliary augmented power driven to the front for extra traction. Whereas on the Toyota, it's a little bit different. The car comes with an engine that's mounted crossways. So in other words, this engine's mounted transversely. And of course, the transmission's behind it, and it drives primarily the power to the front wheels. And of course, secondary is the rear wheels. What does all this mean? Well, old school Mercedes, usually rear wheel drive, that's what they know. They use an engine to drive the rear wheels, and that's pretty much the recipe for most modern day and old school Mercedes-Benz. That's what they know, and that's what works. Toyota, on the other hand, is now flirting with different technology. And that's where we get into this interesting conversation about why this Mercedes can actually potentially outlast this car if you do some of the right tricks and tips that I'm about to share with you. Because in a lot of ways, this Mercedes is actually built better than a modern day Toyota. But let's look at some of the tips that I would do to keep this car on the road longer than the Toyota. We all know that one of the biggest destroyers of engines is strain and heat. Naturally, in this Mercedes, we have a turbocharger. That does create heat, that extra demand on the oiling and the cooling system. So in other words, to keep this vehicle running at its tip-top and most paramount, and in other words, to keep the engine running the longest that it possibly can, you have to do a bunch of things. For example, right there, following the manufacturer's instructions, changing your oil much more frequently than even the manual says, but definitely use the right weight of oil. Check your oil regularly, because if you run low, you have a lack of lubrication, and you could potentially cause damage to the engine and or the turbo, which is actually mounted down in this space. Right down in there is where that turbo is. Keep the oil fresh, good shape, synthetic, and change it even more frequently than the manual even says. And the reason I say that is, remember, a lot of these prepaid maintenance packages that Mercedes offers, like a lot of vendors, they do it in such a way so that you pay so much dollars down, but then you're locked into a maintenance program that you only have to get so many oil changes with so many kilometers. In other words, they end up extending the oil service intervals for the sake of not overpaying at the dealership level. So yes, you pay up front, but you're not getting as many oil services that you really should be getting out of your modern day engine. So more oil changes, the better. Proper weight, oil synthetic, and you're good to go. Of course, with a Toyota, part of the deal here is, of course, it uses oil, and frequent oil changes as well are important for keeping these things running for tip-top and for many, many years. But one thing we have to remember, as I already mentioned, turbocharged engines take a beating. Toyota now, too, is transitioning. Now, while that's a naturally aspirated engine over there, think about in Toyota where they actually have the turbocharged 3-cylinder engine in the new hot rod GR version of the Corolla. Do you think it's possible to get over 300,000 miles in that Corolla? I seriously doubt it. But Mercedes has been building these engines for some time now, and while there are the occasional failure with some of these engines, for the most part, the proper maintenance, lubrication, and keeping everything tip-top will ensure that thing lasts as long. Also, we can't forget Toyota. Even though the Camry is, again, as I mentioned, naturally aspirated, remember even the Toyota Tundra is another great example of where they've now gone to turbocharging, and even more on the extreme level of the Tundra, you can get it twin turbo V6 as well as hybrid. You talk about additional levels of complexity, that's a recipe for disaster. Mercedes, in many of these models, keep it simple. This is the version that is actually pre-hybrid, so this is still a relatively simple model by Mercedes. The other element to keep your engine running long and sturdy is to make sure you stay on top of your cooling system. Now, one thing to note, of course, Toyota, and I've said this in other videos, that Toyota actually fundamentally builds a slightly better cooling system design. In other words, hoses and clamps like we see down here, we actually have a very simple all-tension spring, which makes it simple. It's a simple change, it's a cheap hose, and people are more inclined to do the maintenance and remove and change these, and they're less likely to leak. So Toyota keeps it simple, and that's where those potentially can last a long time. And Mercedes, on the other hand, is a little different. They use more of these snap fittings like we see down here, where it all snaps together with a lock ring. And the same thing applies to your upper and lower rad hoses on these cars too. Mercedes is using what BMW has used for numerous years now. And it's these garbage hoses that actually have these rings attached. It's a metal clip and it snaps in and it locks. Now it's keyed. You'll notice it has that little key mark there. So you can't put it on always. It only goes on a certain direction. What absolute garbage. Now, of course, it's going to cost you a little bit more of this couillons to get this car to last. But the key thing here is staying ahead of those leaks. So if you get a hose like that starts to leak, or a rad hose that starts to leak, fix it. Don't wait on it. That's the key, is to stay ahead of the maintenance on these cars. Good cooling system is the lifeblood of this engine. As you can see right there, keep things topped up and then you're good to go. Make sure you use the right coolant and then you're good to go. On the Toyota, for example, it's the same thing applies. The difference is these hoses are cheaper, simpler to fix, and of course it's not a luxury vehicle. And so if you want that Mercedes to last as long as the Toyota, you've got to start with that. Do the right oil services and as well the cooling systems. Just change your hoses when they fail. If they fail, replace it. Don't waste any time. That's where you get into the biggest problem. With obviously modern day Mercedes, they're very complex, so don't neglect it. Yes, I understand third, fourth, fifth owners of modern day Mercedes find it difficult to maintain the maintenance on these vehicles, and that's where you sometimes go wrong with these cars. If you in fact stay on top of the maintenance of a modern day luxury car like this Mercedes, you're actually in pretty good shape. It's just that the Toyota is a little simpler, lower cost to operate and maintain, and that's why that third and fourth owner will likely find it a lot easier and more palatable to spend the dollars to keep that thing fixed. The other thing to note, a lot of these cars use an electric water pump, which can be problematic. Of course, they do tend to fail more quickly than your typical mechanical water pump brethren. And of course, over here, now Toyota, on the other hand, used to use conventional mechanical water pumps, electric water pumps. That's a recipe for disaster. So as you can see, Toyota has made some changes in recent years. Some of their engines are turbocharged, some of their poorer practices, for example, like water pumps, are starting to be utilized on the electric side versus mechanically, which also will likely reduce its potential lifespan. And Toyota's just trying to get a little smarter, but the reality in doing so, they're likely giving up a little bit of that longevity and reliability that they once loved. The second item that you have to really pay attention to, how can you get this car to potentially outlast the Toyota? Well, it's a critical one. Let's face it. Everybody likes to look at a bright, shiny new car. I mean, take a look at it. All that shiny paint is just gorgeous and glorious. Nobody likes to see a rusted out vehicle like that one over there. See a little rust like that on your body panel, you're gonna get disappointed with that. And while it's not a real shocker, a lot of the cars from Japan, of course, Toyotas, Hondas, have had some rust problems or integrity of body panels where they maybe don't tend to hold up quite as well as a lot of Mercedes. Now, Mercedes had a spell where they had built some of the earlier generation of the ML vehicles. Some of the vehicles that were built in Alabama weren't all that well put together. They rusted, the plastics broke, they were poor, and they were junk. Mercedes has turned that rig around again, and while they're not the tank that they once were, they're far better. So the key to keeping a Mercedes lasting longer than a modern day Toyota is simple. Keep it clean. You want to wash that car. Definitely keep it clean under there. Don't neglect those areas, because if you neglect those areas, that salt and crap can wind up in behind that fender, and that's where it'll start rust. A lot of modern day Mercedes now are using aluminum panels in some places. We have plastic rockers. That won't rust, so that's a win. Lots of plastic up here as well, but generally the metallurgy is a lot better than you're going to find in a lot of modern day Japanese cars like this, where they are also using plastic here, and they're using plastic on the rockers, which is good because that resists rocks. But unfortunately, a lot of the metal that is used on a lot of day Toyotas and Hondas aren't up to the same duty as a modern day Mercedes. Even the door panels and the metal in general is a lot thinner. Take a look right here. It feels thinner. The metal looks thinner here on the edge of the door. and it's not quite as solid as this. This definitely has a more solid feel to it. And if you look there, the metal even looks like it's got a little bit of a thicker lip on it right there as well over the old Toyota. Things are clearly built a little more solid on the Mercedes front than they are on the Toyota side. So clean under the fender wells, clean underneath all the hard to reach areas. Don't worry about the hood and the roof. Everybody know those areas will take care of themselves. Where a lot of people get snookered, you see those clowns, they roll out of the car wash, and then you'll notice people that don't tend to pay attention or care too much for their vehicles often neglect that space under there, and they'll drive out of the car wash and the top of the car looks shiny, but they forget that this bottom section actually looks really dirty, and they fail to actually give that a proper wipe on the rocker. Now, if you are washing it, make sure you wash it from top to the bottom, not bottom to the top. What I even like to do is honestly get a couple of different rags, usually 3 rags to clean and 1 rag to dry. One, I'll do the top section. I'll usually wipe down to about this area as far as washing goes. I'll use another separate rag for the wheels to keep them in good shape. I'll use another separate rag that I start from this area, work down, and then I'll catch that area at the very end. And then of course I use a fresh rag just to wipe the whole thing down dry. So remember, a clean car, a rust-free car is a car you're proud of, and it's a car you're probably more inclined to keep running longer, and you don't mind putting a little maintenance into a car that looks great and sounds great. Another big one that you have to consider are the automatic transmissions. Now let's face it, Mercedes has been building automatic transmissions for years, and they've had a few misses along the way, but for the most part, most automatic transmissions like you're finding in this particular vehicle, as you see right there on the stock control right there, this vehicle runs a 9-speed automatic transmission that's almost bulletproof. There's actually very few reports of the transmission in these cars actually giving away. They're relatively reliable, they're stout, they're solid, they perform well, and quite frankly, with a little bit of maintenance, that transmission is going to run for a long, long time. On the Toyota, for example, is a different storyline. A lot of Toyotas now run CVT transmission, continuously variable transmission. It's a bit of a mess if we're being honest. And unfortunately, a lot of Toyotas are using CVTs. It's not much more than an ATV belt. A little bit heavier and beefed up, of course, but it's that CVT which honestly is a weak point. And in Toyotas equipped with the CVT, it honestly requires a lot of extra maintenance. Maintenance for the belt as well as the oil. And the transmissions that are mounted with torque converter transmissions aren't necessarily exempt from problems either. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of Toyotas that have been known to have transmission weaknesses. There's a lot of weak transmissions with a lot of these vehicles. Now, they're bulletproof cars, don't get me wrong, but they have a weakness, and a lot of transmissions have historically been a problem. And whereas Mercedes, that's far less the issue. Mercedes and transmissions go hand in hand. And the key to longevity is maintenance. So I already mentioned about engine maintenance, transmission maintenance is key. So do your oil services as per the factory manuals. And we also can't forget, since we're talking about drivetrain, we can't forget about the rear differential. Nothing worse than neglecting a differential on a car like this, and that lets go, and next thing you know, you're piled up and having to face yourself with a $3,500 bill to fix your differential. That's the kind of repair that turns a lot of people off when the car's only worth 10 grand, you know, once it's 7 or 8 years old. That's the kind of repair that a lot of people send that car to the dumpster. Change the fluid, clean the vents, and do your regular inspections. And if you hear any noises, deal with it sooner than later. Generally speaking, don't neglect all those parts, because that's part of your drivetrain, and that will leave you with a hefty bill if you neglect it. Another weakness actually of Toyota versus Mercedes happens to be what we're looking at right down here. And what is that? We're talking about brakes right there. You'll notice what we have here, cross-drilled, and they're ventilated brakes. In other words, they're up to the task. We got more chomping power, we got more cooling on the brakes. And what does that mean when you got those holes in the discs? Well, let's take a look at that compared to Toyota over here. And the Toyota has a standard brake disc. As you can see in there, it's basically a shiny black disc. This is what you'll see on 90% of the cars on the road right now. But if you've been following my previous videos, you'll know that's one of the consistent weak points of a lot of Toyotas, and that's the brakes. They start to get wobbly and they start to surge or pulsate, and a lot of that is because the brakes are grossly undersized. A little bit of hard usage, and of course, all of a sudden, they start pulsating because they warp under a heavy pressure and heavy duty. Now, of course, the Mercedes, on the other hand, cross-drilled, ventilated, they tend to dissipate the heat a lot better, and they're up to more suitable duty to clamping down from high speed down to slow speed very quickly, efficiently, and without warping, I might add. So generally, that's what a lot of the Euro cars, for example, like Mercedes, they over-engineer things. Now, while sometimes over-engineering their cars can be problematic and very costly to maintain and keep, however, on the other hand, if you do maintain them, they'll likely outlast and perform better than a lot of vehicles like we're finding in Toyota. Now, everyone's going to agree Toyota's a quality product that's going to last a long time, but it's all about the service factor. Could you take a modern day Porsche 911 to a racetrack, race it all day and drive it home? Yes. Would you do that to a Toyota Camry? Probably wouldn't survive it. It's all based on the duty cycle that you're imposing on the particular vehicle. But what else can we do to this modern Mercedes to keep this car running as long as possible? It's tires, right? A lot of people take tires for granted and they think, hey, when they're worn out or it's goes down so far and they get down to so much tread depth, then they're good and it's time to change them. But tires are actually more of an indicator to symptoms of an issue that a car actually might exhibit. For example, the reason I say that, this car, when it's dialed in, will certainly outlast structurally most Toyotas. However, it's just the maintenance to keep it running that way is what deters a lot of people. However, if you can afford to buy this car new or at a premium price, then you should definitely consider the fact that you have to budget for top shelf maintenance. It is a luxury car after all. But let me tell you what the tires may indicate and why you need to maintain them. Modern day vehicle like this is all-wheel drive. So if a tire is blown out or if you have a problem with one tire and you take the car into the shop and you only have one corner blown out, but the other three are fine, but they're all, say, sitting at 40% wear left. Most tire manufacturers are gonna say because it's all-wheel drive, all tires have to be working at the same turning ratio. In other words, you can't put one brand new tire on the back and have these all bald. That will actually certainly take a toll both on the rear differential as well as potentially the transfer case between the front and the rear wheels. That obviously, there's a rolling diameter that can take a toll on the mechanics of this vehicle. That is one thing for sure if you're driving an all-wheel drive like this Mercedes or like the Toyota, that you're buying the right tires and the right diameter tires. For example, if you're driving a two-wheel drive vehicle, say this is rear-wheel drive, the non-4MATIC version, if you have a problem, you can just change a pair of tires. Or if you have a problem up here, you can change a pair of tires. Because it's all-wheel drive, and if you're worn out down to a certain degree, you've got to change them all, of course. Otherwise, you can risk that issue. Same thing goes over here with the Toyota. The recommended course of action, if you lose one tire and the others are all worn out, then you should actually replace all the tires, because again, you're going to pose stress on some of that extra drivetrain, particularly in the differential or the transfer of power up to the transmission. So the percentage of wear is critical to observe, and make sure you're always running on good rubber. The other thing is, if you have too much wear on one side of the tire, the inner edges, you know, if you're talking about a camber, a lot of tires sit like this. If you have too much wear on the inside edge of the tire, maybe you have too much camber going on, or maybe your driving techniques are a little too aggressive. In other words, always make sure that you've got the appropriate amount of camber, toe in, as well as you make sure your vehicles are properly aligned and your tires are properly balanced. Otherwise, some of that stress, strain, and unbalance will then transfer to your differential or transmission, and again, reduce the wear of that vehicle. Keep your tires in good shape, well dialed in, and then you don't impose extra stress on this car. This Mercedes will last a long, long time. And that takes me to the other point, is why typically Toyotas have been very, very reliable in that regard, is most typically been front-wheel drive. Unless you're dealing with the Tundras and the Tacomas, most of them have been front-wheel drive. Now they're going to all-wheel drive, CVT transmissions. Now you're talking about other points of failure and other considerations that not everybody driving a Toyota is going to worry about. Obviously, people driving a Mercedes are more typically enthusiasts, and they're generally going to watch out for those details. But the same principles apply. Proper tire inflation, wear, balance, and you're good to go. Now, whether you're driving a Mercedes or you're driving a Toyota, the same basic principles apply. An engine all runs the same. It's an internal combustion engine. In other words, air and fuel in, spark, timing, boom, exhaust. And that rotation goes on and on. That does not change. So think of it from that very much at a fundamental level. You just got to take care of it. So the next point I want to talk about is maintenance. Whether we're talking about Mercedes, you've got to do coolant changes regularly, coolant flushes. You got to do air filters. That keeps the air into the engine very, very clean and in good shape. General maintenance is always utmost priority. Transmission fluid and filters, as we mentioned. Under here, we have brake fluid reservoir. Make sure your brakes are flushed every 2 years or X amount of kilometers as per the owner's instructions that you'll find in the glove box. Now, this car doesn't have a timing belt, but for those cars equipped with timing belts, that's a must do. You must do your timing belt regularly, because if that fails, that could potentially take out your engine. Toyota, on the other hand, right here, same storyline. Water pumps, timing belts if needed, or a chain. We have air box there. We have brake fluid there. Of course, fresh batteries are always critically important to keep a lot of these modern day electronics working properly. Serpentine belt for your alternator and all your other auxiliaries. Every engine, whether it's a Toyota or whether it's a Mercedes, fundamentally operate the same, and it's change your fluids, your filters, including fuel filter as well, cabin air filter, differential fluid, doors, windows, sunroofs are well lubricated. And it's basic maintenance that's going to keep these vehicles running for a long, long time. Now, Mercedes, while they're very expensive to maintain, if you are in fact buying one, new or used, it's presumed and assumed that you have the money for maintenance and to take care of them. So some people would argue that Mercedes are not all that reliable these days, but the reality is, if you do your proper maintenance, this vehicle can last 250, even 300,000 miles out of this car if you take care of all of those parts and pieces. On the other hand, Toyota here, like we're looking at right there, is a very reliable vehicle. Now the difference is, in modern days, now Toyota is flirting with reliability-based challenges. Why? CVTs, turbos, all-wheel drive systems, modern electronics like you're finding on the dash and some of these infotainment screens. They've had some quality control issues with the Denso fuel pump system, floor mats causing sudden acceleration. They haven't exactly been flawless, but if you do want something that's very reliable, very robust, there still are very few places you can go to get a car that's going to outlast a Toyota. It's just that a modern day Mercedes, if you get the right engine configuration, you do your right amount of maintenance, you too can find yourself living with a car that is up to luxury car standards that can outlive a modern day Toyota. And with all of that said, check out that video, you're gonna love it. That's my comparison of Mercedes and Honda, and talks about which one will actually last longer. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. Catch you real soon. Bye-bye.